was to talk about Australia and South America. And that's quite hard, but I'm going to have a go. And I'm going to do it in a particular way. I'm going to be looking at transnationalism. And transnationalism, or global history, is a new kind of way of writing history. It's a very recent kind of history, because until recently, most historians have been national historians. So historians of Peru have written mostly about Peru, and historians of Australia have written most about Australia. Increasingly, historians are interested in the connections between countries, and there are connections. Secondly, I want to talk about some of the connections between South America and Australia. Australia, South America, Australia. I want to talk about how they have been connected in the past. As a consequence, I want to tell you about the methodology, theoretical or methodological questions about doing transnational history. So first I want to talk about why historians are doing transnational history. I want to give you an example of transnational history between Australia and South America and Australia, and then I want to talk about the method in general, because I think we have to use the method with some care. It's not an easy method to do. So I want to start by showing you, or telling you, about how people have started to say they have to get out of writing about national histories. And there we have three major works, big pieces of work in English. Anne Curthoy's Marin Lake in 2006, Emily Rosenberg in 2012, and Lynn Hunt in 2014. And what they're arguing is that historians need to look at history that is larger than the nation. And it's very recent. When can we date it? When did it start? Well, one of the major pieces of evidence that people show is the Journal of American History in 1992 had a special edition for transnational history. So in 1992, a big journal, the Journal of American History, said we should start doing transnational history. And a whole lot of historians started to say that we need to do post-colonial history. We need a new method for new history. We're now in a new phase of historical interpretation. We're interested in post-colonial history. We're interested in history that goes beyond the British Empire, beyond the Spanish Empire. We need to write history in terms of indigenous people and non-Western people. So we need to start writing about post-colonial history, and transnational history is a really good way of doing that. And we need to look at networks and circuits, how people have moved between countries, which hasn't been looked at before. And that's what the Connected Worlds is all about. Looking at post-colonial and practical demonstrations. And what they're saying is political. They're saying that history is complicit in national history. And national history is not a good thing. National history reinforces people's narrowness. It reinforces people's nationalism. And in the global 21st century, that's not a good place for historians to be. And so historians should be broader in their interpretations, and transnational history is one way to do it. Secondly, this book by Emily Rosenberg, it looked at cooperation between countries, exchange between countries, movement between countries. It looked about consciousness between countries and also about resistance between countries. So showing how countries have actually operated. And what it uses is what's known as relational models, looking at relations rather than the old colonial situation, politics. It's looking at the social relations between countries and the cultural relations between countries. And similarly, Lynn Hunt. Lynn Hunt is one of the biggest Western historians, one of the most famous Western historians. And in 2014, she said we have to remake history from the inside out. Like Jean Rousseau, we should have to rewrite history. Historians construct history. History doesn't just whisper in our ears. History doesn't tell us how to write itself. We construct history. As historians, we make history every bit as much as anyone else constructs it. And we do it for political, social, emotional, all kinds of reasons. We make history. And what she's saying is we've got to start to remake it in a transnational perspective. And similarly, in Australia, where I come from, a whole lot of literature is about transnational history. So, 2008, 2010, 2017, I give you just some examples. So, transnational ties, looking about how Australians have been in the world. They've been in the South American world, they've been in American world, they've been in the New Zealand world, they've been all over the place. So Australians aren't contained by Australia. History is about Australians in the world. And similarly here about transnational lives, from 1700 to the present, again looking about global mobility. There have been sections of the world. Most people die in the country in which they're born. But large numbers, increasing numbers of people move around. And in the past, we know people have moved around. Slaves, convicts, people who are sailors, explorers, people who are refugees. Large numbers of people have moved around, and we need to write them back into our history because our national histories overlook those kinds of people. Now, one of the most important kinds of transnational history is labour. People move for opportunities and for jobs. They move for labour. And Marxism and people who are radical have moved around the world to encourage people to have left-wing and Marxist ideology. So there are reasons for this kind of flux. So people are agents of their own movement, but the history has overlooked some people. It's overlooked, as I say, working class people, slaves, convicts. It's overlooked women. It's overlooked groups who have fallen through our historical lenses. And transnationalism should take account of marginal people, of people who have been left out or neglected in our history, and so we need to be looking at them. Now, why is it that historians are interested in transnational history? I've mentioned there's a lot of literature since 1990. Why is that literature there? And if we look at the context, as I said, historians make history, we construct it. Nobody whispers in our ear how to write it. We make our own history. But why are we making transnational history since 1990? Well, if you look at the world history, we can see good reasons. 1985, the Schengen, the European Union. We've got the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1991. So East and West Europe started to be combined. In 1993, we have the North American Free Trade Agreement. In 1995, we have the World Trade Organization. We have all kinds of international fusions. But the point is that transnationalism doesn't come evenly. It comes in fits and starts. And as you will know, Brexit is a very narrowing development, and similarly Trump in America. Trump is very keen to have a little America. He doesn't want a transnational global America. He wants a protected small America. So what comes around goes around. We can have transnational ties, but we can also stop them. And single individuals can make the difference. So what I want to do is talk about that phenomena, and I want to give you one particular example. I want to look at Australia and South America. Now, they're quite close in the world. There's only the Pacific Ocean. I travelled 27 hours to get here. They're only, 12 or 13 hours from here. There's been very little work done on the relationship between Australia and South America. There should be more. Both places have the same kind of settler capitalism in the 19th century. Very extractive, very colonial. Why isn't there more work done on it? So I want to look at that example, and I want to show how South America and Australasia are connected. So that's the end of that section.
Lo que ha tratado de decir la doctora es que primero va a tratar el tema explicando lo que consiste el transnacionalismo, que es un fenómeno que se ha desarrollado a nivel histórico por el movimiento de la población, de las masas, a diferentes lugares. Como es el caso, es lo que causa que historiadores en su labor de investigar, muchos de ellos se enfocan mucho por ejemplo, historiadores de Perú se enfocan en la historia de Perú, historiadores de Australia se enfocan en Australia, pero con ese fenómeno la perspectiva del cambio del movimiento de las poblaciones para estudiar la historia cambia, debido a que este fenómeno hace que la gente que se está moviendo de un lugar a otro, poniendo sus culturas, cambien sus tradiciones, y muchas veces también no llegan a cambiar y se quedan con esas mismas tradiciones. Luego nos dice que nos va a poner dos ejemplos para explicar la conexión entre Australia y Sudamérica Australia, demostrando así que ese transnacionalismo se expresa tanto partiendo de Australia y manifestándose en migrantes aquí en Sudamérica, como de Sudamérica manifestándose en personas sudamericanas en Australia. Posteriormente, trata de mostrar con lo que es cierta bibliografía, que pudieron ver que eran 3 libros, que eran Connected Worlds, A World Connecting y Writing History in the Global Era, donde trata de demostrar mediante esto que el transnacionalismo no es un fenómeno que haya sido reciente, sino que se ha expresado a través de la historia. Como pueden ver en cada uno de estos libros, se puede ver que cada autor tenía la idea de un mundo conectado, de que no era algo nuevo, sino que se estaba tratando a través del tiempo. Por ejemplo, en la primera obra, que es de Anne Curtis y Marilyn Lake, se trata este fenómeno desde una perspectiva postcolonialista, es decir, que se da un enfoque como si este fenómeno fuera consecuencia o como una especie de rezago del postcolonialismo, en el cual se enfoca desde esa perspectiva y nos trata de explicar a partir de este fenómeno lo que es el transnacionalismo, el movimiento de transnacional. En el segundo libro, escrito por Emily Rosenberg, que es World Connecting, nos habla de una cooperación, más que todo, una cooperación transnacional, con la que explica más que todo la conexión que hay entre los diversos lugares, como se nombró como la conexión que hay entre Sudamérica y Australia, que es de donde viene la profesora. Y por último, dice que uno de los más famosos historiadores y que se enfocó en este fenómeno fue Lin Hunt, que lo vio como que era un fenómeno con causas con diversas causas, de diversa índole, como podría ser causas políticas, causas sociales, causas hasta emocionales, las cuales demostraban la existencia de este fenómeno y que no era solo cuestión de migración, sino que era más que todo un fenómeno que abarcaba más que ellos. Luego, es mediante este fenómeno que explica por qué los historiadores deberían cambiar, o debieron cambiar, o cambiaron algunos, la perspectiva de cómo estudiaban la historia. Por ello es que, habiendo pasado por el enfoque de colaboración, de colonialismo, y habiendo explicado qué factores de diversa índole explican este fenómeno, se da cuenta que en realidad que en Australia se habían movilizado a diversos lugares. Uno de los principales es Sudamérica. ¿Por qué? Porque si bien ambos territorios estaban lejos, había una conexión marítima. Y después, con esa conexión marítima, es que se enfoca mucho en ese territorio, pero posteriormente, luego con el avance de tecnología, ellos comienzan a ir a nuevos territorios. Y ahí es donde se va dando esa movilización de masas, esta transnacionalización. Es el fenómeno del cual habla principalmente la autora. Luego, habla también de que este fenómeno se expresa en que inicialmente mucha gente moría en donde nacía, y eso era muy común en esa época. Mayoritariamente la gente moría en el lugar de nacimiento. Sin embargo, gracias a este fenómeno, gracias a esta migración, es que se ve que la tasa de gente que muere en un lugar diferente al que nació, del que provenía, va incrementando. Y bueno, en el transnacionalismo lo compara también, o lo trata de dar un ejemplo mediante las políticas de Trump, diciendo que Trump se enfoca mucho en su pequeña América, en su América, en lo que para él es América, negando en cierta forma o oponiéndose a lo que es el transnacionalismo, que es un fenómeno que, como bien explica la autora, no es algo constante, no es algo que se manifieste constantemente o sea lineal, sino que tiene un comienzo y un fin, y luego un nuevo comienzo y un fin, y estas movilizaciones se van dando de acuerdo a diversos contextos, diversos factores. Eso sería básicamente.
So I want to look at, in the second part, I want to look at Australians in South America and South Americans in Australia. I want to give you an example of how that has happened. And some people say it's been forgotten. Some people say it has failed. Some people say it has faded. I want to say it's a really good example to show us how transnationalism can happen at certain times and then stop at other times. So I want to show what's known in history, of course, as contingency, how things change, and they change for all kinds of reasons. So it's not just a single constant kind of history. So here you have a kangaroo looking at Paraguay. You have an example between 1893 and 1899. What happened? What happened in this period for us to be looking at it? And what happened was that there was a man called William Lane. And William Lane is a transnational figure. That is, he travelled around the world. He was born in the UK. In 1865, he immigrated to the USA. At 16 years old, he went to America. And then he led the new Australian colony to South America in 1893 to 1899, and he died in New Zealand. So he's gone right round the world. He's one of those people at that time who was travelling around the world. And why he did this? Well, he was a compositor. That is, he worked on newspapers. And he was a radical. That is, he was left-wing. And so when he went to America in 1865, it's known as the Great Upheaval. And this is a period in which American workers were rising up against their employers. And the employers were using very violent means to suppress their workers. So it was a very violent time in American politics. And William Lane is there, and he's horrified. He's left-wing, he wants workers to have control, and he's in the midst of the employers being extraordinarily violent to crush worker trade unionism and worker activity. He doesn't want to stay in America. He wants to go somewhere else. So he decides to go to Australia. And he sets up a newspaper called the Boomerang, and then he sets up a second newspaper called The Worker. So he's the editor of The Worker. It's a very famous newspaper in Australia, a very important newspaper. Then all of a sudden, Australia starts to be embroiled in trade union activity and violence too. So in 1890, there's known as the Maritime Strike, a huge strike all the way across Australia and New Zealand. And it had huge numbers of workers who were out on strike, and they lost. That was a failure for the working movement. Immediately after, in 1891, the shearers in Australia had another strike, and this was another massive strike, and the workers failed. 12 workers were imprisoned, and William Raine wrote this book, The Working Man's Paradise, to try and raise money for the families of the imprisoned workers, and also to educate people into the working class movement. So I want to make 2 points. The first point I want to make is that William Lane was transnational, international because of the literature he read. He read international literature. So he didn't read just British literature, or just American literature, or just Australian literature. He read Karl Marx's Capital, which was first translated in 1887. He read Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. He read Henry George, Poverty and Progress, 1879. He read Edward Bellamy, Looking Backwards, and he wrote one of the classics of Australian historiography. So there's somebody who's a newspaper man who found books worth reading, and his newspapers were putting extracts of these books to educate the rest of Australian working class. He wasn't Australian, but he was teaching Australian working class how to be educated. And the second point is that he led 1,000 Australians to set up a colony in South America. He thought that Britain wasn't a good country to live in. He went to America thinking that it was a new country and he could start again. He found America was a country with bad social relations, so he went to Australia. He found that Australia was full of upheaval. Surely there could be some place that you could make a better world, and he thought South America would be the place to make the better world. Well, of course, South America had wars. Paraguay had lost a large proportion of its males in wars and battles. It was very keen to have settlers. And so the Paraguayan government gave the New Australia land in which to set up a new colony. So they set up a new colony. They left in 1893, and they set up this new colony. And it was, to some extent, you might see it as a failure. In 1899, Lane himself left. And so 1,000 people to South America, and after a while it didn't work. Now, why didn't it work? Because William Lane was a Puritan. He wanted to insist that the people who went to the new Australian colony didn't mix with the local people. So he might have been feminist, he believed in women's vote, but he was a racist. He did not believe in intermarriage between races, and he thought that the Australians should not cohabit or bring in local South American people. He didn't believe in drink, teetotal. It wasn't a very what you describe as a kind of fun kind of environment. So it kind of failed. However, we can find all kinds of, and there's a whole historiography. It was really important for the mind of the socialists that they had a place where they could try socialism. They could try to put it into place. And so there's a whole number of books written about this. In 1912, Stuart Graham wrote a book on where socialism failed. So this is before the Russian Revolution. The notion is that if you set up a socialist colony, it's not going to succeed because you're going to get oligarchy and you're going to get people who are not going to be interested in good socialist relations. Then you've got a peculiar people, the people who came. Gavin Salter in 1968 wrote A Peculiar People about the Australians in Paraguay. Then you've got Michael Wilding writing about the Paraguayan experiment, and he's much more positive. So you've got these notions that, at one stage it was a failure, and then it's an interesting example, and then it's a wonderful example of transnationalism. And then you've got Anne Whitehead's book, The Paradise Enslaved, in which case she's also arguing that it's a very good example of transnational relations. Okay, there's lots of examples at this period. I want to emphasise the 19th century. So between 1870 and 1914, I can find lots of examples of Australians coming to South America and South Americans coming to Australia. Here we have Christopher Watson. His name was Johann Christian Tunck. He was born in Chile. He was brought up in New Zealand, and he became the first Prime Minister of a Labour government in Australia, first Prime Minister of a Labour government in the world. And he is a South American. He's a transnational South American. As I say, he was born in Chile, brought up in New Zealand. He became Prime Minister of Australia. He travelled around that kind of circuit. And he introduced some of the most progressive legislation in Australia. His government included a guy, J.B. Higgins, who brought in a notion of a fair wage for a fair day's work. 8 shillings for a day's work. This was extraordinarily progressive. It set the benchmark for what was a decent labourer's salary, a decent labourer's wage, and it was the groundwork for the whole of industrial relations in Australia and New Zealand in the 20th century. New Zealand and Australia have one of the highest standard of living in the world, and Chris Watson's government was responsible for introducing that. Now, there's been a lot of work written on Watson. Here's you've got Ross Macmillan's book, So Monstrous a Travesty. And what Ross Macmillan emphasises is that people look at Watson as a progressive and forget that he was South American, forget that he was transnational, forget that he was part of a much bigger story. And so Ross Macmillan wants to put Chris Watson in his wider place. So it's a transnational story about South America and Australia. So I want to make 2 points. One is that it stopped. It stopped about 1914. Now that's World War I in our terms. So it stopped about 1914. It also, and one of the reasons it stopped, it's not what's known as contingent, is because maritime sailing between South America and Australia and New Zealand stopped. It was very vigorous in the 19th century up until 1914. And it stopped, and that's one of the reasons behind the change. And it's a very important issue also to do with flows of people. So before that, there'd been miners, there had been groups of people involved in construction, there had also been radical people. There were all kinds of reasons why people would shift between Australia and South America, and those reasons stopped at that point. So that is the issue 1870 through to 1914.
comienza la doctora cuestionando si este fenómeno de transnacionalismo a través de la historia ha sido un error, o ha sido olvidado, o ha sido una falla. Y para aclarar esta duda es que se sostiene el transnacionalismo en la imagen del canguro mirando a Paraguay. Esto que expresaba el fenómeno de la conexión de la que ya se ha hablado entre Australia y Sudamérica. Pero ¿por qué se enfocaba, como se mencionó anteriormente, este fenómeno en estos dos territorios? Como mencionó casi el último, es que había la vía marítima que era muy activa en ese entonces. Y por ello es que la gente de Australia se trasladaba a Sudamérica y terminaban viviendo en territorios como Paraguay o Chile o entre otros. Y una de esas expresiones es William Lane, que es, como ya lo mencioné, es una figura de transnacionalismo. ¿Por qué? Porque él nació en Reino Unido, emigró a Estados Unidos, luego terminó en Nueva Zelanda, la colonia de Sudamérica, y luego murió, en Nueva Australia, y luego murió en Nueva Zelanda. Este movimiento constante se debe a que en ese entonces ella define como un contexto no tan beneficioso, porque los empleadores, los trabajadores, había un conflicto debido a que había una especie de explotación o un fenómeno que es constante entre trabajadores y empleadores, al menos en ese entonces. Y eso se expresa no solo en la imagen de William Lane, sino también en los periódicos que van a publicar noticias acerca de cómo este fenómeno se va expresando, cómo hay migrantes de Australia en Sudamérica, cómo estos van relatando obras como Working Man's Paradise, donde se trata ese fenómeno, donde se explica y se ve cómo funciona ese fenómeno. Luego también podemos ver en la imagen del barco, donde también se aprecia migrantes yendo a Sudamérica, si no me equivoco, por este mismo fenómeno de la presión que había entre empleadores, trabajadores, y por todas esas cuestiones históricas, todo ese contexto histórico, es que este fenómeno lleva a que muchos migrantes lleguen a Paraguay. Por ello la imagen del canguro mirando a Paraguay. Posteriormente es que cuando se conoce esta especie de territorio o especie de colonia llamada Nueva Australia, es donde se comienza a cuestionar si estos fenómenos de socialismo, los movimientos de la opresión que había entre empleadores y trabajadores, ha fallado, porque la gente seguía trabajando, había gente que no estaba interesada en estas cuestiones, y eso se puede apreciar en los 4 libros que mostró la doctora, que era Where Socialism Failed, a Peculiar People, The Paraguayan Experiment and Paradise Business, donde en el primero se demuestra, se explica que en realidad existía gente que no estaba interesada en este movimiento, en el movimiento socialista, lo cual se explicaba mediante también el fenómeno de William Lane, que era un trabajador, empleador, si no me equivoco, que iba trasladándose, y lo mismo pasaba con todos los migrantes, que muchos de ellos se movilizaban pero no se encontraban interesados en este fenómeno. Igual se muestra en el libro de Gavin Sutter, en el cual se trata este fenómeno, se explica por qué especie de contacto cultural que hay entre la gente que migra de Australia y el territorio paraguayo en el cual están viviendo. Posteriormente, la doctora trata el fenómeno de otra figura transnacionalista, que es el caso de Chris Watson. Ella explica que, si bien en el primer ejemplo explicó cómo Australia estaba teniendo contacto con Sudamérica, cómo migraba la gente de Australia a Sudamérica, posteriormente también se ve cómo la gente de Sudamérica, habiendo entrado en contacto con la gente de Australia, migra a otros territorios, migra a otros continentes para poder lo cual expresa el fenómeno del transnacionalismo. Por ejemplo, el caso de Chris Watson, que llegó a ser primer ministro de Australia en 1904, lo cual era sorprendente en ese entonces porque estaban recién teniendo contacto con este fenómeno migratorio. Y luego eso también se expresa en esta obra de Some Monstrous Travesty, en el cual es una obra que, es una historia que trata en la historia de Chris Watson, en el cual se enfoca cómo todos en cierta forma olvidaron que no era, o sea, era un migrante en sí, y cómo ellos al estar a una especie de nivel más alto, eran un nivel cultural más alto a nivel mundial, no notaron, o al menos en ese momento no les preocupó, debido a la educación que tenía Chris Watson, que él fuera migrante. Y eso se va expresando en este fenómeno.
So what I want to just do in the last section is to go back and look at the method. So we have a call to do transnational history. We can do it if we pick a good example, and I think that we can by looking at New Australia and Chris Watson. That is a good example of transnationalism. And I think some of the work coming out of transnationalism is extraordinarily helpful. So Osterhamel has written a book about the 19th century, and he argues that even though the calls for doing transnational history are 21st century calls, that the 19th century shows us some very good examples methodologically to look at transnational history. And he looks particularly at transport. And the example between Australia and South America is built on that kind of analysis. So you've got resources, you've got industry, you've got connections over trade, and they're very brought together and cemented by transport. The transport, the steamships, and the opportunities to make wealth was such that they encourage transnationalism. But if we, what I mentioned before, that we also can stop transnationalism. We have a couple of examples. We've got Brexit. We've got the UK pulling out of the European community. And it's an example of a large section of interconnection which is going to stop. And in terms of trade, in terms of population, ease of population movements. And of course, one of the reasons why people like William Lane and Chris Watson were able to travel was that you didn't need documentation. You could shift between countries very easily. If you're British in particular, in Australia, New Zealand and Britain, you could just shift around. You didn't need any permission. And now, increasingly, people are putting in place all kinds of checks and balances for immigration. As global warming is occurring, as refugees, economic refugees, in your part of the world you have Venezuela. You have people who are moving in which countries are very concerned about this mass movement. People are starting to put up walls again. So what can be transnational can easily step back from being transnational. So this image here just shows you, if you like, that maybe this notion that transnationalism in the world is just one great big network. We're going to get globalisation. There's going to be just continual globalisation is exaggerated. People break up the world in all kinds of ways. And there are still families of nations. And there are still countries which work very well together. So Britain may be leaving the European community. It was always uneasy about joining the European community, particularly after 2 world wars. But the rest of Europe is seeming at the moment to be connected. And one individual, it might be a president or it might be a politician or a social activist, could actually make a difference for other countries. Greece or Italy could be leaving the European community. Indeed, the Nordic countries had a referendum. So it's easy enough to disrupt. That's the whole point of this, is that transnationalism works amongst some countries for some of the time and not for other countries at other times. So there are commonalities and linkages. And even when there's trade or people movement, it doesn't necessarily mean that the countries are culturally connected. And that's another check and balance so that you can look at mobility, you can look at large numbers of people moving from one country to another, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those countries are going to be connected always. There's contingency and change, and there's also underlying issues of the degree in which a country is connected to another. So it's that Marxian idea that difference in degree involves difference in kind. And so that some countries are very well connected and other countries are never going to have that kind of history or background. It's going to take some time for those countries to develop that. I just want to show you one other example. I've used this, I've used a couple of examples because I think biographically we can see this as being very useful. Here you've got one of the most well-known Australians, Dawn Fraser. Dawn Fraser won 8 Olympic medals, 4 of them were gold. She won, something like 16 Commonwealth records. She held 39, she's a swimmer, 39 swimming records. And Dawn is of Peruvian descent. Her grandfather and great-grandfather and the people before that were born in Peru, in Lima. Her great-grandfather fought in the Guano Wars, 1865. He died 2 months later, not from injuries sustained in the battle against the Spanish, but he had tuberculosis. And he left his widow with 4 children and no means of support. And Dawn's grandfather, Michael Lima, he came to Australia as a sailor in that period I was talking about, in the late 19th century. And he married, and Dawn is a Peruvian descent. So I can give you lots of examples of individuals shifting in that period, and that period is very important to be looking at. So just to conclude, I want to make 2 conclusions. So we have to ask broad questions about transnational. There are different kinds of transnationalism. So when people made the clarion call to do transnationalism, they didn't identify kinds of transnationalism. And that's what we've got to look at. We've got to look at transnationalism. Sometimes it's mobility, sometimes it's progressive, sometimes it's without friction, it's easy. But other times it's going to be not involving many people, it's going to be very conservative, because transnationalism can actually be conservative. So in Australia today, there is a great deal of, you might have heard of boat people coming to Australia, jumping the queue, paying to come into the country. And it's been a cause of great conservatism in Australian politics, because the Australian politicians want to build a wall, just like Trump wants to build a wall from Mexico to the United States. No person who's come to try to get to Australia as a boat person will ever be allowed to settle in Australia. And as a consequence, Australia has set up concentration camps. We have offshore islands in which children have spent 6 years in camps, and they're never going to be allowed to come to Australia. So it's not a progressive. Sometimes transnationalism can be progressive, but sometimes it can be extraordinarily conservative in its outcome. It can fail. It doesn't have to always lead forever to transnationalism. I think what's going to happen between South America and Australia is that transnationalism is going to increase. So in 1996, New Zealand got direct air flights to San Diego. And in 2012, Australian Qantas started to fly directly to South America. And the New Zealanders had to go through East Island. So we're starting in a new era to have more connections. There has been, 2 years ago, an Australian South American Business Council established. My university now has a Latin American studies program. So we are starting to get more interest. Australia now has 0.43% of its population is South American, and it's growing. So I think, and there are now 86,000 Australians living in South America. So I think we're starting to get a development of more connections between South America and Australia. And so I think that's the second major point, is that once for transnational doesn't always mean always, and many people have seen it as structural. Trade, language, history, but it can also be of agency. We can create a new transnational relationship built on new 21st century kinds of connections that are not long-standing. And I think we're going to be finding that in the world. And I think given the future, that the Pacific Rim is going to be increasingly important. Just as Bradell and the Annales School looked at the Mediterranean, the Pacific Rim is going to be increasingly important for all of the countries around that rim. And it's going to be about new agency and new politics.
Ya para concluir, comienzo hablando en este nuevo sector o área de la exposición, comienza hablando de Osterhammer, explicando cómo él aprecia el fenómeno y cómo este fenómeno se sigue expresando hasta la actualidad, en el 2014, exactamente, y cómo, si bien cuando el fenómeno se expresa a nivel cercano, entre países que son cercanos, esto como que se puede diferenciar en cierta forma. Entre ellos se diferencian de dónde provienen, porque es muy fácil que este fenómeno se dé entre países cercanos. Sin embargo, cuando este fenómeno se da, como es el caso de Australia y Sudamérica, entre países separados por un océano, entonces este fenómeno comienza a tomar mayor relevancia y comienza a notarlo más, y donde le dedican un estudio como el del libro de The Transformation of the World, en el cual se estudia este fenómeno y se le aprecia desde la perspectiva del autor. Además, también el autor indica que si bien ese fenómeno de transnacionalización, en el cual las masas se mueven, se movilizan de un territorio a otro, también se denota que por el territorio hay ciertas conexiones entre los tipos de territorios, no solo por sus ambientes, sino también por los animales o la calidad de vida que hay en ambos territorios, los climas o ciertos aspectos que hacen considerar que tal vez dichos territorios están conectados de manera natural, no solo a través de la población, no solo a través de la migración, sino también a través de sus factores naturales. Y como un último ejemplo, trae el caso de Dan Fraser, que es la ganadora de la medalla de oro de las Olimpiadas, la ganadora australiana, quien tenía familia peruana. En el caso de su abuelo, si no me equivoco, era de Lima. Y bueno, en Australia se desenvolvió y ganó una medalla de oro en las Olimpiadas, pero nadie se imaginaría que ella tuviera familia peruana. Y ya a nivel de las conclusiones, la autora quiere acotar dos principales anotaciones para toda la exposición, en las cuales se responde a la pregunta si el fenómeno es una hipermovilización, o es progresivo, es radical, o simplemente son fricciones del pasado, si son rezagos de los fenómenos históricos, cuando en realidad lo que es este fenómeno es que a veces falla, otra vez es olvidado, pero es un fenómeno, no es que es una línea constante, sino que es un fenómeno que suele tener un fin, un inicio, un fin, un inicio. Esto como ejemplo toma también el caso de que los políticos de Australia, en un tiempo que debido a estas migraciones tenían una política semejante a la de Trump, la que maneja Trump con los muros entre México y Estados Unidos, y por ello se dio una concentración dentro de Australia. Ahí fue donde se podría decir que el fenómeno paró, se detuvo. Pero posteriormente, se ve en el caso del año 1996, donde en Nueva Zelanda se ve gente que migra hacia Santiago, y en el 2012, donde se siguen apreciando esas migraciones, es que se ve que el fenómeno no es que se haya parado, sino que al parecer se ha vuelto a reiniciar, y así es un fenómeno que no es constante, tampoco es radical, de que en un momento se expresa y otro ya no, sino que inicia, se detiene de acuerdo al contexto en el cual se dé este fenómeno. Y por último, tome en cuenta de que el transnacionalismo, por la contingencia que tiene, no puede ser considerado solo como un factor o como una estructura, sino como ambos. Porque si, como factor, como agente, causa o expresa la movilización de las masas, de las poblaciones en los diversos territorios, y como estructura expresa la conexión que hay entre estas poblaciones a nivel cultural, a nivel de tradiciones, en diversos aspectos. Ellos expresan también el ejemplo también para poder ver esto, para poder ver las conexiones o para poder ver causas de las conexiones, son el caso de los refugiados o estas movilizaciones a causa de diversos fenómenos que se dan de acuerdo a la época histórica. Eso es todo.
Well, thank you very much, Melanie. For our tradition, Latin America is very important, the French school, but in your experience, your New Zealand, Australian historiography, what is the more important, the American, the British, the Marxists, or not Marxists? What is your...
What's it, in New Zealand and Australia, it's, I'm going to be talking about this a bit tomorrow, is that there is a family of nations, and New Zealand and Britain and Australia were very connected, and they were connected because of immigration. So the settlers who went to Australia and New Zealand, 95% of them were British, and it's not just that they came from Britain, but large numbers of New Zealanders and Australians went to Britain thereafter. So there were 10,000 young Australian women and 10,000 young New Zealand women in Britain before World War I. So they would go for a couple of years, like gap years, and they would spend time. So there were real big circuits. And that stopped in World War II. So the single most important thing was the fall of Singapore. So Australia and New Zealand thought that Britain would protect Australia and New Zealand from Japanese forces and from other forces at that time. And they failed, and so that the Japanese overran Singapore, and at that point New Zealand and Australia began to look elsewhere for connections and for political relations. And New Zealand and Australia opened embassies in Washington, and Washington opened embassies in New Zealand and Australia. And the second most important thing was 1973. And in 1973, Britain joined the European Common Market. And so New Zealand and Australia had sent all of our primary produce to Britain. Britain had bought nearly all of our produce. And all of a sudden, Britain said, well, we're going to join the Europeans. And so New Zealand and Australia had to look for other markets. And so now New Zealand milk is sold in China, and many of the connections in Australia are with Asia. And in Australia and New Zealand, certainly in Australia, the third biggest income earner in Australia now is international students. And most of those international students are coming from China and Asia. And so I think the whole balance of relationships has changed. It used to be with Britain, and now it is much more with Asia, probably more with China than it is with America. So it's changed a bit.
Yeah. Bueno, con respecto a la pregunta que se planteó, lo que la doctora dice es que entre Nueva Zelanda y Australia hay claras conexiones. Fácilmente se puede tratar de un ejemplo de que 10.000 hombres o mujeres de Australia van a Nueva Zelanda y a la vez la misma cantidad regresa de Nueva Zelanda a Australia. Y este fenómeno es expresión de esta conexión que existe entre dos países, semejante a un circuito. Pero con la Segunda Guerra Mundial, con las fuerzas japonesas, chinas, movilizándose en todos los territorios, se da también este movimiento de transnacionalismo. Desde este movimiento y estas conexiones se expresan más. Es por ello que ante todas estas conexiones, todo este circuito y todo este movimiento, se podría decir que productos o gente o diversos rasgos de las culturas de ambos países y ante la movilización de población por la Segunda Guerra Mundial se van encontrando en diferentes lugares. Por ejemplo, la leche de Nueva Zelanda se va encontrando en China y diversos productos de Australia se van encontrando en otros territorios de Asia. Eso es una expresión de esta conexión. Lo mismo pasa también con respecto a las embajadas. Por ejemplo, cuando ya se detiene o termina lo que es la Segunda Guerra Mundial, Washington lleva embajadas y salen embajadas en lo que es Australia y Nueva Zelanda, y lo mismo a la viceversa, en Nueva Zelanda y Australia instalan sus embajadas en Washington. Y con respecto a lo de intercambios estudiantiles, resalta que Australia es como que uno de los más importantes con respecto a esos intercambios. Tiene un gran porcentaje de estudiantes internacionales, teniendo estudiantes de China, de Japón, dentro de su territorio, y que ello es muy normal y es muy común dentro de Australia por lo mismo, y Nueva Zelanda por las mismas conexiones que existen entre ambos países.
De acuerdo al programa, si alguien tiene alguna pregunta para la doctora, podría plantearla en español al compañero que está traduciendo o en inglés. ¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta?
Hay una duda que me resulta mucho en relación a Australia, porque tengo entendido todavía que aún le rinde algo de pleitesía a la corona de Reino Unido. Es una comparación muy grande con América Latina, porque lo estuvo comparando con América Latina. Entonces, en América Latina esto ya no se rige desde hace más de 2 siglos aproximadamente. En cambio, en Australia sí. ¿Qué cambios considera que han ocasionado esto dentro del tema político, económico de ambos territorios?
That he said is that nowadays Australia have like I don't know, is always in favor of the UK, the people, the prince, the king in UK, they like I don't know how to say. They like the government in UK, the way that monarchy, these aspects.
Right.
Australian
Republic, not becoming a republic?
Yes, Australian like the way how lead the UK, the government, like monarchy, like this. But in Latin America, it's different. We don't want this. We don't like this way the monarchy. We used to prefer a republic, yes, this way, and which factors, political, economic factors, determinate this.
So there was no war of liberation for the establishment of Australia or New Zealand, and of course Australia began as a convict colony of Britain, so it had a clear relationship. There was a referendum in 2001, and the Australian people were asked if they wanted to create a republic, and most people voted against it. It is true. But they voted against it because they didn't want a president. They didn't want another politician. They wanted no change, not because they love the Queen. In fact, I'm not sure they do. It's they didn't like the alternative. So it was politics. It was politically inspired voting. So it was a very generational thing. The older people voted for monarchy, the young people voted for republic, and most people just didn't want change, and they certainly didn't want another Australian being put up as a president. So it's true, that's very different, because we didn't have a war of liberation, we didn't have a revolution. Australia was not born in that kind of situation. So it wasn't a oppositional situation in which it was brought up. And look, it's very hard to work out when Australia became independent. People pick a whole lot of different times. So that in Australia, was only a nation in 1901. So before that, they were just the Australian colonies, the Australasian colonies. And New Zealand didn't join the Australian Federation in 1901. And it can join any time it wants. So without even asking Australia, New Zealand at any point, if they have a referendum and decide to join, can just simply join Australia. So it's very recent. People point perhaps to Dominion status in 1907, when the Dominions got self-government. People point to the Westminster Statute in 1947. People point to a whole lot of times when did Australia become what it is. And I think what you've got is peaceful change without a radical revolution, and so that just hasn't occurred.
Bueno, las conexiones o la relación que se mantiene entre Australia y Reino Unido se debe más que todo a la época colonial, por ello esas relaciones que están muy ligadas a esas culturas. Sin embargo, si bien había una revolución para que sea totalmente independiente de Australia, eso no es porque ellos amen la corona o que amen totalmente la corona, sino que prefieren mantenerse así, no un cambio, no quieren un cambio, muchas veces quieren mantenerse en ese estatus porque están acostumbrados a eso. No es tanto un amor a la corona, sino es más que todo un rechazo al cambio. Eso se debe porque quieren más que todo me valorizan más el contexto pacífico que la revolución y la independencia. Es propio de su cultura, es por ello que sí, es cierto que es diferente el caso, es opuesto el caso de Latinoamérica con respecto al caso de Australia. Es por ello, por ese rechazo al cambio y no ese amor a la corona, sino el rechazo al cambio, que se debe esta relación casi opuesta en ese aspecto.
I would also add that Australia stopped having a white immigration policy in 1986. So in 1986, Australia decided to drop the white Australia policy, and that meant that immigrants needed to come from countries which were deemed to be okay. UK, Netherlands, Europeans, but not anywhere else. And what's happened in the last 30 years in New Zealand and Australia, in Australia now, over 50% of Australians have a parent or themselves born overseas. And so in the last 30 years, Australia has become multicultural. And large numbers of people do not, I just don't think they think about the British Queen or that relationship. So I'm a new Australian, I'm a New Zealander. I didn't become Australian until 2015. And I didn't affirm a oath to the Queen. I affirmed an oath to the country. So I didn't actually take an oath to the Australian Queen. And so nearly a quarter of Australians and New Zealanders are living outside Australia and New Zealand. They're the most expatriate countries in the world, except for Dubai. And so many Australians and New Zealanders are living outside. So it's a really interesting question about why Australia and New Zealand, given the immigration policies and given the nature of the societies, why they still have not abandoned monarchy. And I think it may be something like history, you know, that people, as I say, are very reluctant to have change.
Una respuesta se centra más que todo en las políticas migratorias, en el caso de 1976, en el cual Australia tiene un cambio con respecto a esas políticas migratorias, porque la gente, bueno, en ese entonces la gente blanca había detenido su nivel migratorio, pero 30 años después, ahora en los últimos 30 años, es que Australia se ha vuelto más que todo un país multicultural. Es decir, no es solo... Ya, este movimiento migratorio se ha expresado en la multiculturalidad de Australia. Ella cita su propio caso, en el cual habla de que ella ha vivido en Australia, ha vivido en Nueva Zelanda y está en Australia actualmente. Entonces, como que esta multiculturalidad se expresa y se mantiene en los últimos 30 años en Australia. Es por ello que sí, si bien es cierto, es bien interesante la pregunta con respecto a la oposición que se encuentra entre esos dos fenómenos de Latinoamérica y Australia. Cabe resaltar también que en Australia, al igual que en Latinoamérica, también hay una multiculturalidad, la cual hace notar o hace pensar sobre esta posición. Pues esa posición que se expresa no tanto por, como repitió la doctora, no tanto por el amor a la corona o alguna preferencia hacia ella o ese sistema de gobierno, sino más que todo ante un rechazo al cambio y una preferencia a ese estado en el que se encuentran.
Yo tenía una consulta que ya la crítica social de filo marxista también abordaba estos desplazamientos, encontraba violencia y todo. ¿Qué se diferencia esta visión que primó en los 60, 70, con un contexto, pues, por ejemplo, de lo que pasaba en Francia, el 68, por ejemplo, ¿no? Se critica estas políticas coloniales. En todo caso, se está cuestionando las movilizaciones. ¿Cuál es la diferencia con los estudios que hoy en día se conoce como historia global o algo por ahí? ¿Cuál es la diferencia en estas?
¿La diferencia entre el transnacionalismo y el fenómeno?
No, la visión materialista, marxista, vamos a decir así, de los 70s, 60s y la historia global que se está haciendo. ¿Cómo aborda estas movilizaciones?
¿Cómo aborda el marxismo de los 70 el fenómeno que
sí,
la actual historia está abordando, esa migración? He said that which is the difference between the Marxist socialism in 60s, 70s and the historical studies from nowadays.
Okay, so what's different in the historical studies in the 1960s and 70s?
60s and 70s, but from socialism, Marxism, and the actual studies from the actual
historical.
This phenomenon, transnationalism, difference between the perspective of socialist Marxism and the actual perspective of the story.
So the difference between socialist histories of the 60s and 70s.
It's the difference between how they study socialism, how they study this phenomenon.
Right. Which phenomenon are we talking about? Like the phenomena of immigration.
Yes,
how the study of the immigration has changed. One of the things that is very difficult in some ways it seems, for Australian and New Zealand historians is to face the racism which is implicit in the history. And so it's been a difficulty for left-wing historians who are, whose ideology is progressive, and they've had to go back and see that many of the people who were operating that time were actually rather sexist, rather racist, and so there's been a lot of soul searching. It's been a difficulty for historians to do that. So they ignored it in the 60s and 70s. They just ignored it. So progressiveness was about left-wing politics, not about social relations between people such as women and men, or coloured people and Aborigines and white people. And it only developed amongst a number of communists in Australia in the 1950s and 60s that they needed to work on both those aspects. And as a consequence, the history now is starting to look back at how the Indigenous and feminist movements have emerged despite the left-wing politics.
But from the perspective of Marxism,
Marxist, yeah.
they,
See, in Australia, the Communist Party was strongest in World War II. So Australia had 20,000 communist members in 1945, and New Zealand had 10,000 communist members in 1945. The government of Australia, the Prime Minister, Menzies, attempted to bring in legislation to outlaw the Communist Party in 1951, and he failed. So there was a referendum, and the people of Australia said, you cannot outlaw the Communist Party, you just can't, get rid of it. However, the numbers who were members of the Communist Party have dropped dramatically. And then they factionalised, and there were Maoists, and there were Albanian Communist Party, and different kinds, so it just fractured. And there are very few, there's the Communist Party of Australia, which was so strong, is now not very strong. And one of the reasons is that trade unionism collapsed after 1990 in Australia, more so in New Zealand, but also in Australia. And so the organising basis of much of the Communist Party has been undermined. And a number of those people who were Communist Party members who didn't leave when Russia invaded Hungary, in 1956, or they didn't leave with the revelations of the Stalinist trials, but remained, became historians. And so in the 1960s and 70s, some of the most important historians in Australia were Communist Party members, people like Ian Turner and a number of these other people. And the histories they wrote didn't look at the problems that they were facing. And so they wrote history where they didn't include women, and they didn't include Indigenous Australians, and they just didn't include them. And subsequently, people have gone back and said that they were particularly concerned only with certain questions, and are showing that they are criticising and protesting what kind of history they wrote. Does that answer a bit better? Yeah.
La diferencia en cómo le enfoca la perspectiva actual de la historia y del marxismo, socialismo de los 60, 70, radica más que todo en que para el marxismo, socialismo era una visión más progresiva. Ellos no veían tanto el fenómeno, estudiarlo como fenómeno en sí, sino como que una especie de fenómeno que se da en lo que se llega al verdadero fenómeno que ellos querían estudiar, que era ese cambio social mediante la dialéctica y todo lo propio que desarrollaba el marxismo. Particularmente en el caso de Australia, por la misma dificultad de diferenciar estas perspectivas de los historiadores, en Australia se daba el caso de que el movimiento comunista era muy fuerte y ante ello es que el Estado da ciertas políticas para poder frenar esto. Y por ello que muchos de los historiadores más famosos de Australia que tienen esta perspectiva de marxismo-socialismo, pero no consideran ciertos factores que lo sí lo considera del enfoque actual, se podría decir, que son, por ejemplo, el movimiento migratorio de mujeres, su participación, los niños, esos otros factores que el marxismo-socialismo no lo tomaba en cuenta, ya que ellos no lo veían como que un fenómeno en sí, sino lo veían más que todo como un fenómeno que sucede en lo que pasa, lo que de verdad estudian, que era la evolución histórica. No le daban tanto enfoque con respecto al fenómeno como le están estudiando ahora como el transnacionalismo.
Bueno, Melanie, we have a student in postgraduate history, student de undergraduate history and science. ¿Podrían decir de qué escuelas son? Renato es de Derecho, por ejemplo, tercer año de Derecho. ¿Qué otras escuelas tenemos acá? Tenemos Historia, el pregrado y el posgrado de Historia. ¿Qué otras escuelas hay?
Sociología.
Sociología. ¿Otra escuela? Administración. Ciencias políticas. Comunicación social. Bueno, el evento actual es el 11º evento del año. Quisiera compartir con ustedes, ya para terminar la sesión, una gran alegría. Este día fue la tercera sesión del seminario de Global Study con la Universidad de Texas Christian University. Ya hay un grupo de chicos de segundo ciclo a tercer año de San Marcos, saben inglés, y la idea es internacionalizarnos. O sea, vamos a cambiar esto. Vamos a hacer un curso de inglés para que desde el pregrado manejen el inglés. Es decir, Melanie es parte de toda una iniciativa. La Universidad Nacional de Australia es bastante grande, bastante importante. Hay algo de común entre Australia y Perú, que es el mining study, estudios mineros. No, Perú es un país minero, hay empresas australianas acá. El día de mañana estamos en la embajada australiana para hacer presente al embajador la Global Study Initiative. Australia está con gran interés en el Pacífico Sur, del cual Chile, Bolivia, Ecuador y Perú son parte. Como les ha informado Melanie, la Australia National University ha empezado su Latin American Study recién este año, haciendo la convocatoria, ¿no? Entonces, para ellos Latin American Study es más importante este proceso de integración global. Putin, Erdogan, Trump, bueno, son coyunturas, son challenges en este siglo, pero vemos que esta integración es un proceso importante, ¿no? Y San Marcos, diríamos que está dejando atrás el siglo XX, ¿no? El siglo XX que conocemos cómo es, las tradiciones, y nos abrimos al siglo XXI. Yo les digo que ya hay un grupo de estudiantes de segundo año que están muy conectados, muy relacionados, no de historia, sino de varias facultades. Además, el programa con la Universidad Estatal de California, que permite a estudiantes de acá del pregrado hacer 2 semanas en el Estatal de California. Tenemos ya un programa con la George Mason University en Virginia, y otros programas. La idea es, y todo gratuito. ¿No? La idea es que si tienen el nivel académico, no tienen por qué tener costo. Esa es la idea, ¿no? Por eso es una universidad pública, estatal, ¿no? Entonces, son algunos hechos que quería compartir con ustedes, ya que se ha tomado la molestia de estar aquí presentes y apoyar la iniciativa. Y bueno, para terminar, con Melanie en la mañana estuvimos en la Casa de San Marcos, en un sitio que le ha impresionado, magnífico para hacer una summer school, quizás el otro año, ¿no? Pensando actividades entre la Australian National University y la St. Martin University, no solo de historia, ¿no? Sino en general de Global Study, que comprende economía, comunicación, arte, political science, antropología, etc. No se limita a historia, ¿no? Sino es estudios transnacionales. Y bueno, la idea es esta relación que hemos empezado. Melanie es la primera historiadora australiana, neozelandesa, en Lima, en San Marcos, en el Seminario. Entonces quisiera esta primera sesión, espero con un fuerte aplauso, invitarlos a tomar una foto final.
I'd just like to thank you very much again for the opportunity to come to Peru, come to Lima, and to enjoy and learn much more about Peruvian history. And we've been to the museums, and we went to the San Marcos Centre this morning. We've been to the Adobe Pyramids. I'm learning a great deal about the country, and I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity. So thank you.
Está agradecida por este evento, este acogimiento que ha tenido su ponencia, su presencia. Le ha gustado mucho Perú, lo que ha visitado, como ha mencionado, que ha visto a la casona. Le ha gustado mucho lo que ha visto, ha aprendido de la cultura peruana y le ha agradado, ha sido de su agrado. Le ha gustado. Y ha resaltado ello, que le ha gustado cómo, la cultura peruana, cómo la han recibido, este interés por este aprendizaje sobre la historia de estos fenómenos y más que todo particularmente sobre su ponencia y está agradecida por su presencia a ustedes.
Quisiera también dar un fuerte aplauso a Renato, que nos ayudó en la interpretación de toda la sesión, que son actividades que están abiertas, cualquier alumno de cualquier escuela, ¿no? Cualquier grado, posgrado que tenga interés puede apoyar el seminario con estas iniciativas. Antes a Renato, a Andrés Pestañeda, a Rodrigo Pozo, y ya tenemos a Renato de la Facultad de Derecho, y quisiera también agradecer con un fuerte